welcome. We have an hour here this morning in the company of three really remarkable people. Any one of these people I could gladly spend multiple hours with, but unfortunately we only have an hour, but I want to get to them as quickly as possible. Also, this question that we're discussing today, the whole question of internationalism, whole question of sustainability, is the most urgent, perhaps, of our time, and one which is made all the more extraordinary based on what we've all been through in terms of the pandemic in the past 18 months, when so much of our usual travel patterns have been taken away from us, but we have, each of us around the world, encountered the local in a way that perhaps we haven't in a very, very long time. As Jonathan mentioned, we have three people joining us today. Omar Rajeh from, originally from Beirut, but in Lyon, in France now. Karine Polwart, up the road in Pathhead here. I'm here in Edinburgh. And Nana Oforiatta Ayim, who's joining us from Accra in Ghana. So I suppose this is witness of the sort of internationalism that we've grown used to over the last 18 months, and perhaps shows that getting on planes and trains isn't always absolutely necessary. But I'm really interested in how this has gone beyond simply the practicalities of whether we're traveling by plane and train, and how this question of the artistic viewpoint of sustainability has moved into the practice of each of these artists and of the way they think about their work. So I'm going to ask each of them to address that question, and perhaps on quite a personal level. And I might start with Omar. Omar's just left us. He was here presenting a wonderful film which we commissioned during the festival. He's a choreographer, dancer, and director. There's a wonderful company called Makamat Dance in Lebanon, and has presented work throughout Europe and the Arab world. He's the founder of the Bipod annual dance festival, which is a huge resource for choreographers in that region, and has created a school dedicated to contemporary dance, and founded a digital arts space called Saturn in Beirut. So he is both an artist and an enormously important cultural entrepreneur in that area. So welcome, Omar, and I might just ask you to just begin this conversation today.
Hello, Fergus. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with Nana and Karine. I'm gonna start immediately by saying that my approach to the international stems from this idea of link between the international and the locality, and the play in between, starting from a base and to use the word also expansion, and to think of the international as a space of experience, inspiration, and interaction. So this idea of expansion of the locality, not from a national perspective, but from a perspective of growth, of sustainability, of interaction, of thinking of the locality in action. And to also to keep in mind that with the ideas of course of travel, we're always thinking of the international from a local perspective. However, we could look at it from a different, from the opposite side, as the local from an international perspective. And this is what, for interesting dynamics between. This is something that is highly important, and this is how I, maybe through my experience with the festival in Beirut since 2004, the need for creating this space for exchange, the need for also allowing possibilities for the audience in Beirut to see international work, to also to have access to thought, to new ideas, to new practices in the performance, in the same way working with the international artists coming to Beirut to explore this locality with the local scene. And this is maybe what I've encountered in the last year, in the possibility of not traveling, not moving around. I was thinking mostly I was focused on the younger generation that is starting to develop their work, starting to do their work, and this is something I believe we need to highlight, maybe to talk more about, or to discuss more. But I would like to highlight it today in our discussion, maybe to take it further in the talks, and to go back also to this locality, international, thinking of this dynamics of this play of thought that is moving without creating kind of a border for ourselves, without fixing ourselves, and how this it affects also our need for knowledge, our need to expand in our thoughts and in our cultural work. And I would quickly also end by saying that what is needed probably today, whether from a practical perspective in terms of the direct creating actions directly linked to inspiration, is to really formulate a cultural discourse that does not rely mainly on what I would call all dynamics of cultural practice. Probably what maybe this pandemic highlighted, what the travel highlighted, the possibility of traveling or not, it was positive maybe in the sense of focusing on the locality, but what is mainly needed, I believe, is to think of a cultural discourse to create clusters of thought between organizations, local, international, mixed organizations, and to think of what is this space of interaction and how this space of interaction could affect maybe or influence our perceptions of the artistic work, for sure, but also the social political dynamics within the locality and within this global perspective. And probably today, more than previous times, we can feel the impact of smaller actions maybe taking places in different parts of the world, how they could affect our lives wherever we are, and and this is what is probably we need to highlight and to take into consideration and to reassess all the time. So I would conclude by this idea, really, of this idea of clusters of thought intertwined, that is beyond borders, that is also allowing much more openness and much more tolerance and accessibility to thought and culture.
Thank you so much, Omar. I think this question of cultural discourse that doesn't rely on old dynamics of cultural practice is something that this group of people is really doing great work on. So I'm going to turn to Karine Polwart now, who is a songwriter, a musician, a storyteller, and a writer, and she's one of Scotland's best loved musicians. And her music straddles folk and pop and jazz and all sorts of indescribable areas. She created a beautiful theatre work at our festival a few years ago called Wind Resistance, which focused on ecology and sanctuary and solidarity. And just a wonderful new album out, the musician called Dave Milligan, which we were lucky enough to hear the results of at our festival a few days ago. So, Karine, again, it's really the same question. It's just your response to this on a personal basis of how are we going to look to these, what are these new dynamics, and not just in the broadest cultural policy sense, but also from a personal point of view as an artist.
Yeah, well, I want to thank Omar for so much of what he said, because it resonates a great deal with me. The idea of learning, sharing knowledge, discourse, curiosity, solidarity. There's so much in what Omar said that is very much what I think is of value about internationalism. I think, for me, one of the big things in thinking about internationalism is also about thinking about localism, because my practice comes from folk music and folk culture, which is the most localized form of kind of cultural expression that there is anywhere in the world, and is often thought of as parochial and small in its outlook and perspective. So I'm interested in the fact that when we think about internationalism, often we're thinking about it in a hierarchical sense, that international artistic cultural practice is at the top of a tree, and at the bottom of that tree is localized, community embedded, participative arts practice. I think that's deeply wrong and has to change, and we have to regard these two different kinds of work as part of the same ecosystem and informing one another. And I guess in terms of my own practice, I'm very interested in how global and international issues and questions manifest themselves in very localized ways. So internationalism affects the content of my work, but I'm always looking for the kind of granular level way to express that from literally outside my back door and within a 5 or 10 mile radius of my house. How do the issues of climate and sustainability and human movement and migration, how do they manifest themselves in my village and the surrounding community? And they do in every place in Scotland and every place in the world. And I feel like I'm best placed to tell the story of that from where I live, and that's not parochial or local in some sense. It is also part of an international story. But I think we need to address these hierarchies of esteem around the kind of work that we make and the demeaning of local and community-based culture. Because I think that's really where I see my own practice developing, is in an even smaller kind of localized level. I think sometimes, and this is certainly true in my sector of folk music, and that when we talk about international work, it's shorthand for export and market growth, and for taking work to quite wealthy, privileged, often quite socially and politically conservative diasporas around the world. So there's a question around how feeding diaspora communities and markets influences the kind of work that we make and where we want to make it. I'm skeptical about that now, as the focus of work. I guess I'm also mindful though that I'm middle-aged and I'm middle class, and I'm at a point in my career where I've already had an opportunity to travel and make really beautiful and long-term meaningful connections with artists around the world as a result of that. I think we are moving towards a time where the kind of experiences I've had as an artist are not going to be ethically or environmentally sustainable for many that are coming in my and our wake. So I'm really concerned to make sure that when we think about international cultural practice, it's not about a bunch of senior, established, privileged artists like myself dictating to others how they must be. It's about finding kind of common ground and responding to the moment that we're in.
Thank you so much, Karine. I think it's very true, and I often think of the expression when people talking as being of an international standard. that again, that hierarchy is that international kind of touring world is the apex of artistic achievement, and then you begin to go down it. So it's very interesting. So we are now going to turn to Nana, who is puts certainly your achievements are extraordinary in terms of the breadth of what you do. I mean, you're a writer, a filmmaker, historian, and you live and work in Accra, in Ghana, and act as a special advisor to the government on museums and heritage, and looking at the country's museum restructuring program at the moment. You have an extraordinary project which is pioneering a Pan-African cultural encyclopedia, and a rethinking of what museums can be through your mobile museums project. You were curator of the incredibly successful Ghanaian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and in 2019 published The Godchild, your first novel. So you're very, very welcome, and we're really interested to hear of your perspective on this question.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's been incredible to listen to Omar and Karine. I think there's so much resonance in terms of what they were saying. And Karine, especially what you were saying about this hierarchy of the international to the local. I'm just going to spend a few minutes just explaining my context and where I'm coming from, just because I'm sure many of you are not so familiar with the context here in Ghana. I came back home about 10 years ago after having worked abroad for 10 years and having lived abroad for a bit longer than that. And I had been working in the arts, and it was very, very important to me when I came back to ensure that artists, creative makers didn't have to move abroad in order to be sustainable. I had realized when I was coming back that there was not really any kind of structural ecosystems, ways of being financially sustainable. And so what I tried to do in the first couple of years that I was here was connect artists to international institutions, etc., so that they could stay in Ghana, but still have that kind of sustainability to allow them to continue their work. So I worked with artists like Ibrahim Mahama, whose work is behind me, and other artists. But what I began to realize was that the art spaces that we had, especially in the capital, the galleries, I can't really say museums because that's a whole nother story, our museum sector, were attracting the same, let's say 50 to 100 people for every opening, etc. And in a way, that's one of the reasons I had left London where I was staying, was this kind of elitism or inward looking or capsulism of what I saw of the art world. And so I asked myself from the very beginning of when I was here, is how do you broaden out, this cultural exchange, this cultural expression? I went to Afasia, which we translate as festivals, all the time in my hometown. They are these cultural expressions of music and dance and design and history and performance, etc. And they attract everyone. I mean, people come back to their hometowns. You have every class of society. And I asked myself, how can these traditional cultural expressions attract so many, and yet these so-called contemporary or modern attract so few, or the same kind of people? And so I started to ask myself, is there a way to combine, the kind of contained form of these contemporary expressions with the inclusivity, etc., of the Afasia? And so I started looking around for an architectural model that might encompass this. I found the kiosk, which is on every single street corner. It's a barber shop, it's a hairdresser, it's a mechanic, etc. So why not a museum? I developed this museum in the kiosk, which then I converted into a mobile museum so that it could go into communities across the country and not be confined to Accra. This has probably been the most enriching work of my career, is connecting with communities, learning, exchanging. And the thing that I really delved very deeply into was this indigenous knowledge systems that we have. I feel like it's the thing that I have been longing to connect with since the very beginning of when I started my work. But this idea of knowledge systems that were developed over thousands and thousands of years, whose public trajectory got interrupted by the colonial encounter, but whose private trajectory is still ongoing. These indigenous knowledge systems were so holistic. They decentralized the human being in a way, because the environment, nature, is as important as people. There was this interdependent aspect where the arts and science and technology and mathematics, etc., stood side by side on equal level. And so I've kind of vaulted all my focus onto these indigenous knowledge systems and how to share them and how to create new languages in order to communicate them. I'm making a film at the moment on a rainforest in my hometown, a nature reserve which is being threatened by extractivism, using the indigenous knowledge systems as a model of conservation. And also the pandemic, the shift that happened with the pandemic when our borders closed temporarily, and it looked like we were going to be shut off. And I know that these conversations fit into this wider framework of culture and sustainability and education. And I think for a lot of us here, it made us look inward. What do we have here that can heal us that we don't need to import from the West? Because at some point we didn't know whether imports would stop. Lots of people started planting, farming, going back to what our ancestors did. And I kind of put my focus on something I've been, fostering for a very long time, which is this idea of a school where indigenous knowledge systems are the basis of what we do, where we're not just focusing on imported ideals or notions, but really developing these educational and knowledge systems that have been passed down through time. Another thing that came out of the pandemic is these new networks. I was part of a program online which involved, similar to this, people from all across the world, and we started to build these new networks across Ghana, Vietnam, Bolivia, Barbados, where similar to me, my peers and co-creators were thinking of these new models of being, these new ecologies of knowledge. How do we create out of what's been called the portal of the pandemic? How do we create these new ways? How do we not go backwards? And so that's something that I think was really valuable, and in a way a kind of new type of internationalism, which is very rooted in this local, but reaches out to each other, which is, I think, also what Omar and Karine were referring to a bit. I just want to end on, you mentioned the Venice Biennial, which I did in 2019, which is, of course, the kind of, in the arts world, the peak of internationalism, where countries or nations represent themselves in this supposedly international context. It was important for me to do that in a way because of the resonance that I felt the local could have to the international. I've also seen the effect that it's had in Ghana in terms of the commercial, how do I call it? The kind of international look that's come onto Ghana, but also the loss of a kind of inward lookingness. And so it's really interesting to me as we now consider whether to do the next Venice Biennial and whether to keep presenting us on a world stage, what that exchange does, what we bring out to the world, and then what the world does back to us, and whether we have the strength and the power to prevail in a way in a world that has for the last few centuries been dominant in putting its narrative onto us. And how do we retain the strength of our local voices within this international context? And for me, one of the ways that I found that I can do this within different spheres, whether it's talking about restitution and the return of African objects from Western museums, is to create what Omar termed as clusters. You know, these clusters within the international, you know, it might be clusters where there's people from Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, or like I said, Vietnam, Barbados, etc., where in a way that we call safe spaces for us to create these new languages, these new forms that we can then present to the wider scary world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's fascinating about Indigenous knowledge systems and how they drew in culture and science and a lot of disciplines. It actually reminds me a bit of the Scottish Enlightenment, and Patrick Geddes, one of the great figures who always said, think local, act global. And I think there's definitely something in relation to the relationship between the local and the global that's coming out here. For anyone who has any questions, there is a Q&A box there, and we would love you to pop in any questions that you have, and I will happily put them to the panel. I think there's so much in what people are saying there, but I do think that this question of the right place for internationalism. I mean, as someone who's been kind of running festivals, I think there's been a marked shift probably in the last 10 years where internationalism was generally seen as a good thing. And there was a shift where people began to think of it as part of a kind of Davos set of kind of neoliberalism and globalism and people who just dotted around the world. And it feels that it needs some reinterpretation at the moment. So it has some kind of positivity. So I'm just interested about where, within this context of how we kind of connect the local, how we connect that local view of the world with it. And Omar, I'm really interested in your idea of clusters, and what does that look like in a sort of a practical sense? Because I know you've been working in the digital realm on this.
Yes. Well, it's just also, I think it's I would like to just to focus on this point of, you said, with this idea of the international and the look for the international. I feel sometimes we need definitely to be very critical of things, but at the same time we need at this parallel to this to look at the value rather than the industry, and this is what we could separate in terms of internationalism, like this idea of market, of product that could go and circulate like a commodity, with more a value that is outside of what could be interesting for me in terms of this values of thoughts or values of ideas, and thinking of the international in terms of the local. I mean, at the end, everything, let's say, most of the things that are international, if started locally. And when I hear the same Karine and Nana talking, it resonates a lot with me, definitely with this idea of how we could take these thoughts into a wider value, outside of borders, and maybe this is also the discussion what sometimes we fall into talking or using words of the us or them or the nations, and probably what we need to talk about is, or what I feel I'm trying to look also at myself in how I'm talking, is more in relation to the profession, is more in relation to the action that we do in our everyday life, rather than kind of a label that was imposed on us. Of course, there is a certain cultural environment, cultural geography we interact with, where we were born, we were raised, but then it's also to open for that. So
thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, just sort of, I mean, picking up on that. I mean, and Karine, as sort of, you know, an artist who would have toured and, you know, some of the practicalities around that. Do you think there's a shift in, you know, what you would have seen 15 or 20 years ago as who's the person people you need to be communicating, or what your role as an artist is, and do you think that's shifted in relation to, you know, particularly the climate crisis, I guess?
I think it has, yeah, and not just for me, but in conversation with pals and peers who are musicians and makers of different kinds. And some of it speaks to some of the things that Nana has talked about, the idea of what spaces we present our work in. I love the idea of the kiosk and trying to kind of model the architecture of places that have other purposes in people's lives so that it becomes part of your everyday life to experience art. The closest thing to that in a Scottish context would be perhaps the village hall or the church hall. And those are spaces that have become demeaned, I think, in value relative to kind of professional theatrical venues, but actually they're at the heart of every single community across the country. So the reinvigoration of that network of spaces that already exist, that are owned by communities, it's where, you know, it's where toddler groups meet and Zumba classes happen, and but there's no reason why that network of spaces can't be the conduit for much, you know, for much more of what's made here and comes here from elsewhere too. And I think for me, the other thing I was really interested in what Nana said also about Indigenous knowledge systems. You know, those exist in a form here in Scotland too, and notably through our Indigenous languages, through Scottish Gaelic, and the amount of effort that's gone into kind of reinvigorating Scottish Gaelic language and culture, and how those forms of expression are embedded in place and speak to environment and ecology and the history of the ways that people have inhabited land. Those things are live in Scotland too. They're in Scots language, they're in Gaelic language, and there's information there about how to live sustainably, how people have managed that in the past. And I'm curious also about what Nana said around the reinvigoration of growing and food cultures. I think there's something here to be learned also from the pandemic about perhaps bringing a lot of what we make and culturally, whether it's music or theatre or dance, and making that a more hospitable, embedded everyday experience too, through food and through other forms of kind of shared, like, human experience. I think we've lost that a little bit. The idea from folk culture here would be the idea of a ceilidh, where you eat and you drink and you play and people participate and it's performative. That would be this kind of Scottish idea, equivalent to what I'm hearing and what Nana says. So I'm curious about all of that, because that is all about making more of the resources that are built resources, people resources, and kind of idea, language, knowledge resources that exist in each localized place.
Nana, could you maybe pick up on that? Because I do think this idea of, you know, sustainability being of culture being connected into education and food technology and a whole bunch of things is really interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely fascinated by it. And I'm also fascinated by what Karine is saying now about Scottish Indigenous knowledge. It makes me want to get straight onto Google and research that. I mean, we have so much wealth in the world, and it's been, you know, in this kind of globalization or development narrative, it's been flattened so much to this idea of the universal, which is really just one idea, and flattened this idea of the many, many, many pluralities there are. And I think right now is an exciting time to really make space for that. I was really fascinated by what one of my colleagues said from Bolivia, which is that Bolivia has now renamed itself into the plurinational state of Bolivia. And I feel like even just that name change from the idea of one nation and this kind of forcing of all of these communities into one space, allowing for this diversity and this pluralism and celebrating it, I think is incredibly exciting. And so in this imagining of new museums, and I'm doing this through exhibitions and through everything, I'm trying to bring in as much of that as possible, this idea of communities, this idea of co-curating with communities. Who am I to say I'm the expert? Who am I to say as a curator, I'm going to come in and tell you what is important in your culture? I'll learn much more from you because you live and breathe here. This idea of the expert, I think is also a little bit mute. This idea of bringing in food to the museum, to the cultural spaces, bringing in so many different things. We've had such a static idea of what art is, of what the white cube is. It's so limiting. And so to open up, I think is an incredibly exciting thing. And I think, in a way, some of the things that have incredibly negative impact and effects on us, like this COVID crisis, like, what happened with Black Lives Matter, on the international scale. Also, and different writers have written about this. Arundhati Roy, Elif Shafak have written about the opportunities that come from complete breakdowns. And we see this on a smaller scale in Ghana because we don't have cultural infrastructure. And so in a way, even though it's painful for artists who don't know how they're going to survive, who every single day is a struggle and a hustle for them, and that's even those who have the privilege of being able to call themselves artists. There's so many people here who can't even take that privilege. At the same time, we don't have all the cultural infrastructure to undo in the same way that the West has, which is now in the process of decolonizing. We have, in a way, this kind of complete tabula rasa to create something new. And so I think out of every breakdown, out of every lack, there's also some kind of opportunity.
I mean, Omar, there's obviously Beirut has been, it had a cultural infrastructure which is sort of collapsed in a sense, and it is in a very different place because it's starting, but it has the remnants of this extraordinary cultural infrastructure, but and obviously the tragedy, but things politically and socially were in a very difficult way before that. But do you see this as sort of something of the beginning of a reimagination of the cultural infrastructure in Beirut?
It was this, the idea immediately came to my mind, this question, while Nana was talking about the context of Ghana, and I thought, yes, and between me, I said, what about Beirut today? With it is like, between brackets, like the country today is an extremely difficult condition. The people are suffering literally. Since end of 2019, there was a economic political collapse. People went on the streets against this corruption of politicians, of weapons, of militias, and after that, all the banking system collapsed at the same time. Then COVID, it's still going on since March. Again, a huge explosion at the port of Beirut that destroyed half of the city, killing more than 200, injuring more than 6,000. More than 300,000 people were displaced of their homes. So the impact on the city, and even recently the political situation, there was also another explosion outside of in the north, killing more than 30 people, injuring tens, and like the political constitution is still fighting as if the people are like taken hostages, and they it's an absurd. So I was thinking, in the middle of this collapse, what today the situation of the artists, of course, they're continuing. They try to find ways, and I've always thought there is a sentence in Orhan Pamuk, one of the novels, I can't remember which novel, saying like accidents are new departures. And for me, this was a kind of always a motivation, or a kind of a motto that I thought always, yes, accidents are new departure. And this is how I think also of the COVID, because it brings new opportunity to think of culture in a different way, to reassess this old history of structures of culture. However, in the context of Beirut today, the impact is huge, and maybe this was highlighted a bit also in the movie the film that was presented in Edinburgh, with the discussions with the audience. It highlights this cultural interaction in a city like Beirut. What do we do? A big question about also the image of the city is fading out. The people are taken hostages to a very big extent, and it feels like this openness of the city, Beirut, the creative cluster, the dynamic city, the cosmopolitan city, it feels it's falling into more and more conservatism, and this is extremely dangerous. And I'm not able to touch like where we are at the moment. What's going to happen? I think about it in a positive way. However, at the same time, practically, people are suffering literally. What's going to happen? How it will develop? I'm very much hopeful and positive that definitely things will come out. Hopefully in a good way, but it's still difficult to say, and it's still at least in the near future, a lot of artists are leaving the city. I'm in a sense one of them. I was obliged to leave. Maybe I made the decision to leave, but at the same time forced to leave. And this is kind of also of a complex situation of my relationship to the city, my relationship to the colleagues or artists, friends, the dynamics of the cultural scene. Sometimes I'm also, I don't know how to put this in context, talking about Beirut. Am I still part of this cultural scene in the city, or I'm out? And then the question of internationalism maybe comes back here in terms of this local interaction. Where are we based, and how do we link to these localities? And that's why also I try to escape maybe this fact of putting myself within a nation and a border. And I realized that I don't even, when I talk, I don't even mention this word Lebanese, or not that I'm very much interested in the local dynamic, and most of my work talks about this social political context. But at the same time, I feel there is a fine line between how to open this discussion on a wider perspective, and taking it out of like this kind of exotic tourism, maybe, and this is dangerous also in the same context of market product, international, but to touch more on these human dynamics, or human thought that we try to interact within and to create dynamics. So I will end to go also to answer maybe back also with clusters of thoughts. This is more or less the shape of clusters of dynamics. I immediately actually feel a connection with the three of you, with your different professions, with your different journeys, rather than come from. Although this is the bios in your careers, in your journey, but then I try. What is much more interesting for me is the individual with this journey, rather than looking at the general perspective of, let's say, Ghana or my own preconceptions or of Africa and Ghana, and so they're all there, but then it's a matter of how do we navigate within these values without creating big outlines that could also create kind of limitations, could create another borders for ourselves in this interaction and dynamics that we would have.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you so much. Just wanted to pick up on something because obviously I think, well, I'm certainly, I live in Scotland, but I'm not from Scotland. And the idea of home, and because if we're talking about local, we kind of ground ourselves in a place, and how we define, particularly, you know, when you've lived in multiple places around the world, how you fix on somewhere and say this is my home, and how that kind of feeds into practice, because obviously sometimes people have lived in, you know, multiple places, and it's something I find with artists a lot of the time. They kind of go, well, I lose my bearings a little bit because I'm kind of moving around all the time, and how much that idea of being kind of 2 feet on the ground, grounded in a certain place, is a key part of practice. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that. Karine, can I pick on you?
I very quickly. I also feel it. When I finished my studies in London in 2001 or 2, I felt I needed to go back to Beirut, and I felt I needed a base, and I need to create a certain frame structure for the work that I would like to work on. And then there was a certain cause also for me. There's a certain motivation or drive for the work. However, on top of that, I immediately realized that I don't want to lose this interaction with the UK or Europe in general, or the rest of the world. And this is how the idea of the festival came. So I look at it really as a kind of a continuous, they complete each other, and it's important to have this to be structured, but at the same time, this openness for inspiration. There's openness also for interaction, rather than closing.
I would echo
Right.
that the idea of openness and interaction. And just to speak very briefly to the idea of home and to the idea of identity, and living in Scotland and having a Scottish identity, which is still right now kind of socially and politically contested. And that's part of I think that's relevant to living in Scotland and making work in Scotland, is that it's a live issue, how we govern ourselves and view ourselves, and who counts as Scottish. And to have a kind of civic sense of identity is really important, even on a very localised basis, where many of my neighbours who are artists and makers and musicians, they weren't born in Scotland, but they view themselves as Scottish because they live here and they make their work in a Scottish context. And, you know, even within, you know, a matter of the next street and the street over, that includes English accordion players, Argentinian bandonian players, and traditional Ghanaian dancer from Accra, just round the corner from me, but all living here in Scotland. So yeah, home is a difficult. I realise it's a contested concept for many people, but it feels important to me, and it's quite localised. It's literally what I can see from my window.
Great. Well, look, I'm conscious that, you know, I'm involved in a few kind of big projects, and we have these discussions here, but then the minute we actually need to go and talk to politicians and whatever, we have to do economic impact surveys and, you know, show how tourism is going to, it very quickly moves into that economic argument. Or if we say we want to do something around work, they'll say, well, that'll be a showcase, that'll be an international. We move into the language of the market very quickly when we actually start to engage with the powers that be. What do we need to do now at the end of the pandemic to shift that conversation? What needs to happen now? Nana, can I ask you to maybe have a go at that one?
I mean, it's a tough question. I mean, I have found more and more over the last few years that I'm working on the kind of edges of culture and politics. And, you know, because I'm trying to shift things, I'm trying to really move things. And, you know, for the first time since I've been working in this sphere, we have a government that actually has an open ear to culture. So I'm actually kind of almost desperately trying to shift this, you know, until it changes again and culture is completely irrelevant to our government. So I don't know. It's a really difficult, you know, on you know, here in Ghana, I'm not even sure if I can say this. I hope it doesn't get back to the people I'm about to say this about, but I don't know if you've been following, you know, we've had a bill put into existence, a private member's bill, which is essentially an incredibly homophobic bill. And that bill was put forward by our current Speaker of Parliament, who's from the opposition party. He's the same man that I have to go to in order to put through these museum bills. And so in a way, there's this gag on me. You know, I can speak about it, like I can here maybe on my social media pages, but it's, you know, you have to play this tightrope game where I don't know. I think it's a really difficult. I mean, you're talking about the commercial aspect, but I think it seeps into so many other aspects, the moral, you know, like in this case, ethical. You're almost kind of having, you're having to play this game where you don't fall off the tightrope and you're balancing. And how do you shift things within this political landscape that we have inherited, that's come onto us? You know, this in Ghana's case, this, you know, colonial remnant mixed with our traditional, which is, you know, to some extent intractable. And there's this movement right now, you know, this young movement in Ghana, Fix a Country movement, which is trying to shake things. But, you know, I kind of look at it and I'm like, yes, maybe it shifts the atmosphere, but what will it, I mean, I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, but what ground is it really going to shift, you know, in terms of, like you're saying, creating new political dynamics? I don't know, how is that going to happen? I can, my cultural, I can, you know, there, but I don't know. And that's why I feel also that I want to start with schools, to be really honest, because I feel like I might not see that shift within my lifetime, but at least maybe not my lifetime, but maybe, you know, within my kind of current career trajectory, but maybe if I try and bring together people that are like-minded, and we try and pass that on to young kids, you know, these new possibilities of being, of exchanging with the world, not as us dominating the world, but living in some kind of equal exchange with the world and all the elements, then there's a new generation that can grow up that does respect other things than money and power.
Oh, that's such a beautiful thing to say, but also incredibly practical, and, you know, and I think a real kind of note of optimism, actually. that maybe this energy and focus of the end of the pandemic needs to move down a generation and really focus itself. I think that's very, very, very good note in which we might wrap things up, actually. Look, there's so much. For me, it's a great moment at the end of the festival to go away and think about everything. And this conversation has been hugely helpful for me, and just fascinating. So I just want to thank Nana, Karine, Omar. I want to thank the Culture Summit. I'd like to thank all of our technicians, Brendan and Kieran, and for Emily for setting this up. And for all I'll probably see Karine pretty regularly, but Omar and Nana, we really hope to see you in Edinburgh soon, perhaps at the Culture Summit or the festival next year. And just to say, on behalf of everyone out there who's listening, thank you so much. Thank you.